deploying a massive naval aircraft carrier, squadrons of nuclear-capable bombers, tactical fighter jets, attack helicopters, and heavily armed special forces costing hundreds of millions of dollars, all for one single, completely absurd objective: to chop down a tree. In 1976, after North Korean border guards brutally murdered 2 United States officers over a minor landscaping dispute, the US military did not launch a standard retaliatory strike. Instead, they triggered the most overwhelming, psychologically devastating show of force in human history. They brought the entire planet to the absolute brink of World War III just to do some yard work. Today, we are breaking down Operation Paul Bunyan, the ultimate military flex, where America forced its enemy to sit and watch as they deleted a 100-foot poplar tree from the server. Do not look away. To understand how a single piece of wood almost triggered a global nuclear holocaust, you have to understand the mechanics of the deadliest map in the world, the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ. Following the Korean War, the peninsula was split in half. The border between North and South Korea is a heavily fortified 2.5-mile-wide strip of land packed with landmines, razor wire, and thousands of troops staring at each other through sniper scopes. But right in the middle of this zone sits the Joint Security Area, a tiny patch of land in Panmunjom, where forces from the North and the United Nations literally stand face to face. In 1976, this was the most high-stress, zero-tolerance PvP lobby on Earth. There was no physical wall separating the soldiers here. They walked past each other. They glared at each other. The tension was an absolute powder keg, just waiting for a single spark. That spark was a massive 100-foot-tall Normandy poplar tree. In the summer of 1976, this specific tree had grown so large that its thick branches were completely blocking the line of sight between 2 critical United Nations observation posts. In a zone where visual contact is the only thing keeping you alive, a blocked sightline is a massive tactical vulnerability. The US military command decided the tree needed to be pruned. It was supposed to be a standard routine landscaping job. Nobody expected it to turn into a bloodbath. On the morning of August 18th, Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett led a small, unarmed detail of South Korean workers into the Joint Security Area to trim the branches. They carried no heavy weapons, only axes and pruning shears. Almost immediately, a squad of North Korean guards, led by a notoriously aggressive officer named Lieutenant Pak Chul, crossed the bridge of no return and confronted the American team. At first, Pak Chul simply watched the workers, but suddenly his demeanor shifted. He demanded that the Americans stop cutting the tree, claiming that it had been personally planted by the North Korean Supreme Leader, Kim Il-sung. Captain Boniface, following standard protocol, ignored the aggressive demands and ordered his men to continue working. This was a fatal mistake in the North Korean logic. Pak Chul sent a runner back across the bridge. Minutes later, a massive reinforcement truck slammed to a halt, heavily loaded with over 20 North Korean guards armed with crowbars and heavy wooden clubs. Pak Chul looked at Captain Boniface, screamed the order to kill them, and the North Korean guards ruthlessly attacked. It was an absolute slaughter. The North Korean soldiers stripped the axes from the tree trimmers and used them against the Americans. In a matter of minutes, Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett were brutally beaten and hacked to death in broad daylight. The North Korean guards then retreated across the bridge, leaving the bodies bleeding out in the dirt. When the news of the unprovoked murder reached Washington, D.C., the United States government absolutely lost its mind. President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger were furious. The American public was demanding blood. The global server was immediately put on high alert. The US military rapidly upgraded the defense readiness condition to DEFCON 3. The immediate military instinct was to launch a massive kinetic artillery strike to completely flatten the North Korean barracks. But the Pentagon knew that a direct artillery strike could instantly trigger a second Korean War. drawing in the Soviet Union and China, and potentially ending in a global nuclear exchange. They needed a response that was entirely different. They needed a psychological weapon. They needed to execute a maneuver so overwhelmingly dominant, so incredibly terrifying, that the North Korean military would be paralyzed by fear. The US command decided they were not going to bomb the enemy base. Instead, they were going to go back to the exact same spot, finish the landscaping job, and dare the North Koreans to do something about it. They drafted Operation Paul Bunyan. The objective was simple: cut down the tree. The execution, however, was the most massive overreaction ever authorized by a modern superpower. At 700 hours on August 21st, just 3 days after the murders, a massive convoy of 23 American and South Korean vehicles roared into the joint security area without any warning. They bypassed the standard checkpoints and drove straight up to the Poplar tree. 2 8-man teams of elite military combat engineers jumped out of the trucks. They were not carrying rifles. They were carrying heavy-duty chainsaws. But it was the escort that completely shattered the enemy's reality. Stepping out of the vehicles alongside the engineers was a 64-man task force of heavily armed South Korean special forces. These men were elite Taekwondo experts, and they were absolutely furious about the murders. They were hand-picked for this mission, and they came ready to die. In a terrifying display of absolute psychological dominance, several of these South Korean commandos had literally strapped live Claymore anti-personnel mines to their own chests. They stood directly facing the North Korean border, holding the detonators in their hands, silently screaming a challenge: "Shoot us! I dare you!" But the ground forces were just the appetizer. As the chainsaws ripped into the bark of the tree, the North Korean military scrambled. They deployed a massive response force of heavily armed guards, rushing them toward the tree. But as the North Koreans arrived, they suddenly heard a terrifying, deep roar echoing from the sky. They looked up, and their blood ran cold. The United States had brought the apocalypse. Swarming directly overhead were 24 heavy assault helicopters, buzzing the treetops like angry mechanical hornets. Flying just above them, tearing through the clouds, were massive F-4 Phantom II fighter jets, fully loaded with air-to-air missiles, flanked by South Korean F-5 fighters. But the absolute knockout punch was flying high above the tactical fighters. The United States had deployed heavily escorted B-52 Stratofortresses. These were massive strategic bombers that had been flown all the way from the island of Guam, and they were nuclear capable. They were flying in attack formation, casting massive, terrifying shadows over the demilitarized zone. And the flex did not stop there. Just off the coast, completely out of sight but known to enemy radar, the USS Midway, a colossal nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, was steaming into the Sea of Japan, accompanied by a heavily armed naval task force of cruisers and destroyers. Furthermore, the US had mobilized 12,000 additional troops and ordered them to the Korean peninsula. The United States military had effectively mobilized a force capable of wiping a small country off the face of the earth and focused it entirely on a single 100-foot piece of wood. The North Korean guards, who had come ready for a firefight, were completely paralyzed. They realized instantly that they had triggered the ultimate boss fight, and they had absolutely zero chance of winning. If they fired a single bullet, the South Korean Special Forces would detonate their suicide vests, the attack helicopters would erase the bridge, and the B-52 bombers would turn their entire military infrastructure into radioactive glass. So the North Koreans did the only thing they could do. They stood down. They stayed on their side of the bridge, completely silent, and watched. For 42 incredibly tense minutes, the sound of American chainsaws echoed across the demilitarized zone. The combat engineers methodically and deliberately dismantled the tree piece by piece. They didn't just trim the branches this time, they chopped the massive trunk down, leaving only a small 20-foot stump standing as a permanent, humiliating monument to the North Korean failure. Once the tree was destroyed, the American and South Korean forces calmly packed up their chainsaws, loaded back into their trucks, and drove away. Not a single shot was fired. Operation Paul Bunyan was a flawless victory. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The North Korean leadership was so thoroughly humiliated and terrified by the overwhelming display of American firepower that the Supreme Leader, Kim Il-sung, actually issued a formal statement of regret regarding the murders, an unprecedented event in the history of the regime. The United States spent an unquantifiable amount of money burning millions of dollars in aviation fuel and logistical deployment to execute a landscaping task. But it was never really about the tree. It was about proving to the enemy that if you break the rules of the server, the admins will log in and completely rewrite your reality. If you want to uncover the rest of the most brutal tactical anomalies in military history, subscribe to TeamAlphaSix right now. The battlefield is waiting.